And welcome to another episode of Primility Primer, our morning reminder of the power of balancing pride and humility as we go about our daily lives. This is episode number 62, and I am your host, Jared Morris. It is Wednesday, which means that it's time for another edition of Wisdom Wednesday. And as I've mentioned often, this concept of balancing pride and humility is definitely not a new concept. This is something that has been talked about long throughout history. Aristotle discussed it in different ways. Augustine discussed it. Jesus lived it in many ways. And Saint Thomas Aquinas is another guy, obviously a famous Catholic priest, a theologian, a philosopher, who discussed this concept almost in the very same specific terms that we use to discuss it. And so we're going to use one of his quotes today as the basis for today's Wisdom Wednesday examination. But we're even going to go back a little bit further than that, because when Thomas Aquinas wrote and discussed this idea of what was of what is primility then, although he of course didn't use that term, he was really building upon the ideas of Aristotle and Augustine. And back in the Roman times, actually, when Augustine lived, they had this idea of what they called the magnanimous man. And this, in a lot of ways, was a guy who would end up ruling, who would rise to political power, and in a lot of ways would do so because of virtue and because of just being kind of a good guy. But they didn't trust these people, even these quote unquote magnanimous men, because they were still men, and they feared that the power of willpower was never going to be enough to overcome the vices that would be available. Here, let me read a quote, and I'm reading from the book Humility by David J. Bobb, which I've read from before. But here's what I was explaining here. So to Augustine, this position, magnanimous man, is still arrogant. No matter how great one's accomplishments appear to oneself or to the world, they are nothing compared to the greatness of God. So back in these times, a lot of the humility aspect of this was very religious. The magnanimous man sits precariously atop his peak. His self-reliance, ostensibly his strength, is actually his weakness. With self-reliance comes the constant danger that virtue, supported by nothing but willpower, will collapse into vice. And so building on these ideas then later in the 13th century when he lived, Thomas Aquinas began to argue that humility and magnanimity, which in a lot of ways is almost more descriptive in terms of what we discuss as pride than how a lot of people take pride. It's very interesting. But he said that these are complementary, not opposing virtues. Taken together as twins, they help human beings accomplish things of excellence. Very interesting. So here's the quote that I want to get to for today's Wisdom Wednesday. So, and this goes back and forth between the author, Bob, and him quoting Aquinas, and I'll try to make that clear as I read it. Humility, Thomas wrote, is, quote, a praiseworthy abasement, unquote. It is not self-debasement. Quote, consequently, unquote, he explained, quote, the role of humility is not to repress our appetite for high and difficult projects, but rather to keep a sense of proportion in our reckoning, unquote. I'll read that again. Consequently, he explained, the role of humility is not to repress our appetite for high and difficult projects, but rather to keep a sense of proportion in our reckoning. And now this is the author. If true humility keeps aspirations in line by reminding man of his limits, healthy pride helps propel him to greatness by reminding him of his possibilities. Politically, healthy pride also helps man understand his sense of place in this world. It tells him to stand up for himself, his family, and his country, and to keep striving to make himself and those to whom he belongs better. He becomes great in soul when he becomes wholly given over to the pursuit of virtue, desirous of honor for the right reason, and determined never to forsake his virtue. He is great in soul when humility resides in his heart and he becomes selfless in his love for others. Greatness of soul is reserved to the few, not because few are called by nature, but because few are able to achieve the mastery of pride it requires. Obviously, I love that statement. It's a lot of what we talk about here, just stated much more elegantly. But again, going back to the quote of Aquinas here, the role of humility is not to repress our appetite for high and difficult projects, but rather to keep a sense of proportion in our reckoning. And I think this is a lot of times where people struggle with the concept of primility, where I struggle with the concept of primility, is how do you balance your personal goals, your personal achievement, really wanting to get the best out of yourself with the humility of considering others and not letting vanity and conceit and arrogance really drive you. And that's where these two ideas, these two feelings, these two mindsets of pride and humility need to work so well together in balance, and where they can work so well together in balance, because that humble feeling is what helps balance the pride so that it doesn't run rampant, and so that you don't reach a certain position because of virtue and because of all of these good things, and then slowly devolve because all of the trappings of power are trappings that you can't handle, right? But also the pride helps us balance the humility that maybe says we're not good enough, we're not ready, we can't do this, that would rather see us stand up against the wall rather than step out and put ourselves out there. The pride pulls us there. And that's why these two, again, these two ideas, these two mindsets, however you want to view them, they work so well in concert together, because they are opposing forces. But when you put them into the sweet spot, in that middle spot, it's like 1 + 1 = 3. And they balance each other out in a way that actually propels each one forward. So again, I've mentioned this book before, but Humility by David J. Bobb. It's an excellent book. I will put a link to it in the show notes at primility.com/show/062. And a lot of times when I wake up on Wednesday morning and don't necessarily have a quote in mind, I just go to this book because I've got so many of the pages dog-eared and underlined. And there's just a lot of really good quotes like that essentially take concepts that we've talked about and just talk about them in different words. And there are people like Saint Thomas Aquinas and Augustine who have discussed these concepts centuries ago, and we're just carrying that torch now, and of course trying to spread the idea to as many people as possible. So do that. Share this episode, share that quote with someone who you think could use it. I think that's a great way to help spread the wisdom that we try to spread on this Wednesday. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Always much, much appreciated. Make sure you go to primility.com/join and get on our email list so that you get our Friday digest, as well as our Monday morning one positive thought email. And we'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Primility Primer, live at 6:30 Central Time at primility.com/live, with the podcast and blog post up shortly thereafter. We will talk to you then. In the meantime, stay cognizant of your pride and your humility. Wrist bump.